The year was 1865. The air in Jericho Springs was thick with a mingling sense of whiskey, sweat, and desperation. Beneath the dim glow of lanterns, men huddled over poker tables, their faces carved from stone, their eyes flickering with greed. Shadows clung to the wooden walls of the rusted Spur Saloon, whispering secrets only the desperate could hear. Elena Carter had learned long ago that the world had no place for a woman without means. She sat stiff-backed in the corner, hands folded in her lap, a glass of untouched water before her. Her father, Thomas Carter, was slumped over a table near the back, cards fanned in his trembling hands. The man had lost everything but the clothes on his back and the drink in his belly. She should have left him long ago, should have walked out into the night and never looked back. But blood was blood, and a daughter's duty ran deep. The men around the table watched Thomas with the sharp-eyed hunger of coyotes circling a wounded calf. Among them was Silas Graves. He was a man whose reputation preceded him, a gunslinger, a bounty hunter, a killer. They called him Bloodhound because once he set his sights on something, he never let go. His face was as weathered as the Badlands, his eyes like twin shards of flint, and his mouth curled in a lazy smirk that never quite reached his eyes. "Last hand, Carter," Silas said, shuffling the deck with slow, practiced movements. "Make it count." Thomas licked his lips, his fingers twitching as he counted his remaining coins. Too few. Elena knew the look in his eyes, the same one he wore when he placed wagers too heavy for his pockets. He was drowning, and he had no way out. I need to up the stakes," Thomas stammered, his voice thick with whiskey. Silas leaned back in his chair, tilting his hat just enough to cast his face in shadow. "That's so. And what exactly do you have to offer?" The silence stretched. The other men chuckled, nudging each other. They had seen Thomas lose before. They had watched him gamble away horses, land, even his rifle. But there was nothing left now. Nothing but. Elena felt it before he even said it. A deep sickness clawing up her throat. "My daughter," Thomas said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Elena." The laughter stopped. A hush settled over the table. Silas's smirk widened, slow and dangerous, like a rattlesnake uncoiling. Elena rose, the scrape of her chair against the floor cutting through the silence. "You can't be serious," she said, her voice like iron. Thomas refused to look at her. His hands trembled as he pushed forward his last stack of coins, sealing the deal before she could stop him. Silas studied her, his cold eyes sweeping from her boots to the wild defiance in her gaze. Then, without breaking eye contact, he placed his bet. The cards were dealt. The game was lost. Thomas let out a shuddering breath as Silas raked in his winnings. The room spun, voices blurred, and before Elena could move, Silas was standing, his fingers curling around her wrist like a vice. "Looks like you belong to me now," he murmured. Elena fought. She twisted, thrashed, tried to dig her heels into the floorboards. But Silas was stronger, and the room was full of men who wouldn't lift a finger to help her. Her father wouldn't even meet her eyes. The saloon doors swung open, and the night swallowed her whole. The desert was cruel at night. The cold bit deep, seeping into Elena's bones, a stark contrast to the sweltering heat of the day. The moon hung high, casting silver light over the endless stretch of dust and rock. Silas had tied her hands, her wrists raw from the rough rope. She sat behind him on his black stallion, her body stiff with fury and exhaustion. "You'll get used to it," Silas drawled, as if they were discussing the weather. She said nothing. "You're lucky, really," he continued. "Could have been worse. I ain't the type to beat a woman for fun. You do what I say, and you'll live a fine life. Might even learn to like it." Elena closed her eyes. The weight of her fate pressed against her chest, suffocating. She would not scream, would not cry. They rode for hours, deeper into the wasteland. By dawn, they reached a canyon carved by time and wind. A lone campfire smoldered among scattered supplies. Silas dismounted, yanking Elena down after him. Her legs nearly buckled, but she forced herself to stand. "You'll stay here," he said, tossing her canteen. "I need some sleep, and I prefer you didn't try anything stupid." She sat on the hard ground, the taste of dust thick on her tongue. Then a sound, a whisper of movement, barely more than a breath of wind. Elena turned her head, her heartbeat thundering. A shadow detached itself from the rocks, moving like the desert itself, silent, patient, deadly. A man, not just any man. He was tall, lean muscle beneath sun-worn buckskins, his long black hair tied back. His face was carved from stone, his dark eyes unreadable. He carried no rifle, only a knife at his belt and a bow slung across his back. A Navajo warrior. Silas hadn't noticed. He had his back turned, stretching, rolling the tension from his shoulders. The warrior stepped forward, his voice quiet but firm. "Let her go." Silas froze. Slowly he turned. His hand drifted toward his holster, fingers itching for the revolver at his hip. "Now hold on," he drawled. "Ain't none of your concern, Chief." The warrior's expression didn't change. "She is not yours." Silas laughed, low and mean. "Won her fair and square. Paid good money. That makes her mine." The warrior's stance never shifted, but the air changed. A storm gathered in the silence, tension coiling like a rattlesnake ready to strike. Then, everything happened at once. Silas moved. His gun cleared leather. But the warrior was faster. A blade flashed, quicker than sight, slicing through the space between them. Silas barely had time to fire before the knife buried itself deep in his shoulder. The gunshot echoed off the canyon walls. Elena flinched, but the bullet went wide. Silas staggered back, cursing. Blood spread dark and fast across his coat. The warrior didn't wait. He lunged, closing the distance, his fist colliding with Silas's jaw. The gunslinger hit the ground hard, choking on dust. Elena barely had time to breathe before the warrior turned to her, his gaze steady. He crouched, his knife flashing once more, this time cutting through the ropes binding her wrists. "Can you ride?" he asked. She swallowed, rubbing her raw skin. "Yes." "Then we leave. Now." Behind them, Silas groaned, trying to rise. The warrior grabbed her hand, pulling her toward the horse. She didn't resist. For the first time in hours, she was free. But something told her this was only the beginning. The wind howled through the canyon, stirring up loose sand as the first hints of dawn bled across the sky. The Navajo warrior led Elena deeper into the wilderness, his pace unrelenting. Silas's pained curses still echoed behind them, but they didn't stop. They couldn't. Not yet. Elena's legs burned from the ride, her wrists raw where the ropes had cut deep, but she didn't complain. Freedom came at a cost, and she would pay it gladly. The warrior rode ahead, his posture straight, his gaze locked on the horizon, as if he could see something she couldn't. The way he moved, so sure and silent, made her wonder if he belonged to this land more than the wind itself. She had seen men before, hardened men, killers, outlaws, but none like him. Finally, as the sky turned a bruised purple, he slowed. They had reached a dry riverbed, its cracked earth littered with twisted roots and jagged stones. He dismounted first, then turned to her. "Drink," he said, pulling a water skin from his belt and offering it to her. She hesitated only a moment before taking it. The water was warm, but it soothed her parched throat. When she lowered it, she met his gaze fully for the first time. His dark eyes were unreadable, but there was no cruelty in them. "What's your name?" she asked. For a long moment, he didn't answer. Then, finally he spoke. "Taza." Elena wiped her mouth with the back of her hand, considering him. "I'm Elena." "I know." That startled her. "You do?" Taza nodded toward the east, where Jericho Springs lay far beyond the canyon walls. "I saw you in the saloon. Saw him take you." Elena's hands clenched at her sides. "And you just waited?" Taza didn't flinch at the accusation in her voice. "There was no saving you in that room. Not with all those men. But out here," his gaze flickered toward the distant hills. "Here, I had a chance." She let out a slow breath. "Well, thank you." Taza inclined his head, but said nothing. Instead, he crouched by the riverbed, scooping up a handful of dirt and letting it sift through his fingers. Elena frowned. "What are you looking for?" "Tracks." A chill ran through her. "You think Silas is following us?" Taza didn't answer. He didn't need to. The tightness in his jaw, the way his muscles coiled beneath his skin, said enough. Elena swallowed. We should keep moving then? Taza rose. Not yet. That wasn't the answer she had expected. Why? Because running won't matter if we don't know where we're going. Elena blinked, suddenly aware of how lost she truly was. She had spent her life moving from one dusty town to the next, never staying long, never making routes. But out here, there were no roads, no markers, only the endless, untamed wild. And Taza knew it. She exhaled sharply. Then where do we go? Taza studied her for a long moment before he turned, pointing toward the distant buttes rising against the sky. There. She followed his gaze. What's there? My people. Elena hesitated. And they'll help me? If I asked them to. It wasn't the promise she wanted, but it was the only one she had. Without another word, they mounted their horses and rode. Hashtag, hashtag, hashtag. The sun climbed higher, turning the land to gold. The heat pressed down, suffocating. Elena's dress clung to her, damp with sweat, her limbs heavy from exhaustion. Taza rode ahead, silent as ever, his eyes scanning the horizon. She had so many questions, but she held them back. He didn't seem like the kind of man who talked just to fill the silence. By midday, they reached a cluster of rock formations, their jagged edges offering shade. Taza dismounted first and gestured for her to do the same. We rest here. Elena slid off the horse, her legs trembling beneath her. She caught herself before she fell, forcing her body to stay upright. Taza watched but said nothing. Instead, he knelt, retrieving a bundle from his saddlebag and unwrapping it. Dried meat and flatbread. He tore a piece and handed it to her. Elena took it, her stomach tightening at the thought of food. She hadn't eaten since, God, she couldn't even remember. She chewed slowly, watching as Taza ate his portion with practiced efficiency. Everything about him was measured, controlled. Finally, she couldn't hold back any longer. Why did you help me? Taza didn't look at her. Because I could. That's not an answer. He sighed, setting down his food. Silas Graves is a sickness. He takes what he wants, kills when it pleases him. I have seen too many women left to die because no one stood between them and men like him. Something in his voice made her shiver. She swallowed hard. You fought it before. Taza's jaw tightened. I have fought men like him before. Elena looked away, staring at the distant horizon. He'll come after us, won't he? Taza didn't hesitate. Yes. A sharp wind swept through the rocks, carrying the scent of dust and sage. She closed her eyes, her fingers curling into fists. Then we better not be here when he does. Taza nodded, standing. We won't be. They mounted their horses once more, riding deeper into the unknown. Hashtag, hashtag, hashtag. By dusk, the land had changed. The dry, cracked earth gave way to rolling hills and sparse trees, their twisted branches reaching for the sky like skeletal fingers. The scent of rain lingered in the air, though the sky remained clear. Taza slowed his horse, scanning the distance. Elena followed his gaze, but all she saw was more open land. What is it? He didn't answer right away. Then, his fingers twitched against the reins. We're not alone. Elena's pulse quickened. Silas. Taza shook his head. No. A flicker of movement caught her eye. A figure standing atop a ridge. Then another, and another. A group. Watching. Waiting. Taza exhaled, then rode forward. Elena hesitated before following. As they drew closer, the figures came into focus. Men and women, their clothes blending into the earth, their faces unreadable. Some held bows, others stood with arms crossed, silent and still. Then one of them stepped forward. He was older than Taza, his face lined with years of wisdom and hardship. His dark eyes settled on Taza first, then shifted to Elena. Taza dismounted, and Elena followed suit. The older man spoke, his voice low and firm. Taza answered in the same tongue, his words flowing smoothly. Elena understood none of it, but she didn't need to. The tension in the air spoke for itself. Then the older man's gaze locked onto her, sharp and assessing. He spoke again, his tone heavier this time. Taza turned to her. He wants to know why you're here. Elena swallowed. Because I had nowhere else to go. Taza translated, and the older man's expression didn't change. Then, after a long silence, he turned, motioning for them to follow. Taza met her gaze, something unreadable in his eyes. "This is my father," he said quietly. Elena blinked, taken aback. She looked at the older man again, seeing the resemblance now. The same strength in his posture, the same unshakable presence. As they followed him into the camp, a single thought echoed in her mind. She had escaped Silas. But what awaited her here? The answer, she feared, would come soon enough. The fire crackled in the center of the Navajo encampment, its glow casting flickering shadows against the faces of those gathered. Taza stood beside Elena, his posture rigid as his father. Nahazin studied her with an unreadable expression. The silence stretched, heavy with the weight of unspoken questions. Elena fought the urge to shrink under the elder's gaze. She had spent years surviving men who saw her as nothing more than something to be used or sold. But this was different. This man wasn't assessing her worth. He was measuring something deeper. Taza finally broke the silence. "Silas Graves will come." His voice was calm, but the warning in it was clear. He'll not rest until he takes her back. Nahazin shifted his gaze to his son. "And you brought her here. She needed sanctuary." The elder exhaled, glancing toward the fire. "You have put all of us in danger." Taza's jaw tightened. She was already in danger. Elena's fingers clenched at her sides. "I didn't ask for this," she said, her voice steady despite the storm in her chest. "I never wanted any of it." Nahazin's dark eyes flicked back to her. "And yet it follows you." Before she could answer, a distant sound carried through the night. Horses. Taza turned sharply, his hand already on the knife at his belt. The others in the camp moved in near silence, reaching for weapons, melting into the shadows like spirits of the land itself. Elena's heartbeat pounded in her ears. She knew that sound, the heavy, unhurried gait of men who knew they had already won. Silas. Taza motioned for her to stay low, then moved swiftly, disappearing into the darkness beyond the firelight. Nahazin followed, leaving Elena with nothing but the night pressing in around her. She crouched behind a low rise, pressing her back against the cool earth. Her breath came shallow and quick, her fingers trembling as she reached for the small knife one of the women had given her. Then she saw them, a dozen riders, their figures outlined against the moonlit ridge. Silas was at the front, his wide-brimmed hat low over his face, his body slouched in the saddle like a man who had all the time in the world. "Elena!" His voice cut through the night, laced with mockery. "You really think you can run from me?" Her stomach twisted. Taza was out there somewhere. So were his people. But the sheer number of Silas's men made her blood turn cold. Silas pulled his horse to a stop, looking down at the camp, as if surveying his next meal. "I know you're here, girl, and I know you ain't alone." He lifted a hand, signaling his men to spread out. "Come now. You savages don't want no trouble. Just give her back and we'll be on our way." The silence in response was suffocating. Then a voice, smooth and lethal, came from the darkness. "She is not yours to take." "Taza!" He stepped from the shadows, his stance loose but ready. The firelight gleamed off the blade in his hand. Silas chuckled. "Well, look at that. Thought I saw you before. Should have known you'd be the hero type." His grin widened, teeth flashing in the dim light. "But here's the thing. That girl? She was bought fair and square." Taza didn't move. "She is no man's property." Silas sighed, shaking his head. "I'm tired of this game." He turned his gaze toward the darkness. "You hear that, Redskins? I'll give you one chance to stand down. Otherwise," he gestured to his men, who raised their rifles. "We burn it all down." The weight of the moment hung thick. Then, the first arrow struck. It sliced through the air, embedding itself deep in the shoulder of the man nearest Silas. He let out a sharp cry, tumbling from his horse. The silence shattered as another arrow flew, and then another. The night erupted into chaos. Gunfire cracked, bullets sparking against the rock. Silas's men scrambled for cover, cursing as figures moved like ghosts through the darkness. Elena's breath hitched as a hand closed around her wrist. "Come," Taza whispered, pulling her low. They moved fast, weaving between shadows as bullets tore through the night. Silas's voice bellowed above the chaos. "Find the girl." Taza pushed her toward the edge of the camp. "Run." Elena shook her head. "I won't leave you. You must." His grip tightened. "Go south. Follow the riverbed. Do not stop." A gunshot rang out, sending dirt spraying near them. Elena hesitated, everything in her screaming to stay. Then Taza shoved her hard, eyes burning. "Go!" Her legs moved before she could think. She sprinted through the darkness, breath ragged, heart slamming against her ribs. The camp faded behind her, swallowed by gunfire and smoke. She ran until her lungs burned, the sound of battle distant, but still too close. The riverbed was ahead, its winding path stretching toward the unknown. Then a shadow loomed in her path. A figure on horseback. Silas. He reined in his horse, his gun already drawn. Elena skidded to a stop, her knife shaking in her grip. Silas grinned. "You're really starting to piss me off, girl." He aimed the pistol. A heartbeat passed. Then an arrow struck him, burying deep in his side. Silas let out a strangled roar, wheeling his horse in pain. Taza emerged from the darkness. Another arrow knocked, his face set like stone. Elena didn't hesitate. She lunged forward, driving her knife into Silas's thigh. He howled, his gun dropping as he clutched the wound. Taza's second arrow found his mark, striking Silas clean through the chest. The outlaw swayed, mouth opening in a soundless gasp. Then he tumbled from the saddle, hitting the ground in a lifeless heap. The battle in the camp had ended. The last of Silas's men had fled into the night, their will broken. Elena stood over Silas's body, her breath coming in ragged bursts. She looked at Taza, unable to find words. He met her gaze, his own unreadable. "It is done," he said. Elena swallowed hard, the weight of it all pressing down on her. Silas Graves was dead. She was finally free. But as she looked at Taza, the man who had saved her, she realized something else. This was not the end. This was only the beginning.